Many years ago, when I was working in my previous profession, I came across a particular field called road user charges. This is a field about how roads pay for themselves. And I found this field actually quite interesting. I studied in this field, and I actually worked in the profession related to this field. I left that profession quite some years back, and life has moved on quite a bit. But in more recent times, I came across quite a few organizations that claim that roads cannot pay for themselves and that they're subsidized. It seems like in the environment that I live in, people have never heard of road user charges, and that this whole concept is actually quite foreign to them. So much so that if I do a Google search on do roads pay for themselves, it's amazing how many organizations have been able to do a sort of a search engine optimization and come up right up front with bold statements by some very qualified people saying roads don't pay for themselves. But yet there's a formal education into a concept of how roads do pay for themselves. So here's the simple question. How do roads pay for themselves? Do you want to hear more? When you think of self-funded infrastructure, you tend to think of things such as electricity, gas, water, and you get to see like a bill related to the usage. So you see a bill for how much gas you've used or how much electricity you've used. Perhaps even in some cases how much time you spent on the phone. And these will be regarded as infrastructure. When it comes to roads, I think you could imagine toll roads. Interestingly enough, toll roads are a form of road user charges, but nonetheless, you would tend to think that if roads are paying for themselves, then it's only through toll roads. Yet, interestingly enough, under the concept of road user charges, all roads can pay for themselves. It depends on whether or not the jurisdiction overlooking the specific roads implements road user charges. So the question is, how do road user charges work, and how do they actually pay for themselves? Probably the easiest way to explain this is like this. If you take a stretch of road between, say, point A and point B, and in that stretch of road you find that the average vehicle uses, say, 2 liters of fuel to drive from point A to point B. And then you go and look at the price of fuel and how much, if I could say, government charges are placed on that fuel. Now, I have to be very careful of the wording I use here, and you're going to see why shortly. If there is a tariff of, say, 10 cents per litre, a government tariff of 10 cents per litre, then, well, that vehicle would have used 2 litres to drive that stretch of road from point A to point B. 2 litres times 10 cents means that that road has actually contributed 20 cents to driving from point A to point B. Now, multiply that by the amount of vehicles per day, per week, per month, etc., and you actually get to see how much money that stretch of road will make. Simple, right? Well, actually not that simple. There is quite a bit more to it. There's many more levels of sophistication. For example, diesel fuel versus gasoline petrol fuel, as an example. A vehicle using diesel uses a different amount of fuel to travel from point A to point B. The level of sophistication starts becoming a lot more involved in issues such as a big intersection. Where does one road end? Where does another road start, for example? So this whole thing starts working out and evolving quite a bit as far as the revenue generation part. There can be some little bit more sophistication in that I use the term the average vehicle. And really, what is the average vehicle? And what about cars that are below average or above average? How do they contribute or be compensated for their contribution, if they're even compensated at all? Now, the next part to road user charges is the issue of the cost of that road. Interestingly enough, this is actually where the true issue stands and where things start becoming very controversial all over again. The cost of that road is generally broken up into maintenance and rehabilitation, and to a certain degree construction of the road, or replacement cost. The the amount of wear and tear a vehicle places on that road is a factor of the amount of rehabilitation and maintenance that road must go through. And here we start having some issues in that a truck, for example, could impose about 10 times more wear and tear on the road than, say, an average vehicle. But yet, if you look at the factor of how much fuel that truck has used to drive from point A to point B versus its wear and tear, it seems a bit unfair, and it seems like that truck actually has more wear and tear or creates more damage to that road in relation to how much it contributes towards the revenue generated by that piece of road. So from that point of view, road user charges have to take this issue into account, and slowly you start understanding how much more sophisticated it is. How does one charge the truck extra, for example? That tends to be through vehicle licensing, a sort of a balancing factor to say that if a vehicle has, like a truck, has contributed more towards the wear and tear of the road opposed to how much revenue it generates, well, hopefully you can calculate how many trucks come through on that road and in average work out how much they should contribute more. And you can quite quickly see how this becomes a very, very sophisticated field. There is a fantastic website. It's for the government of New Zealand. I've actually put it below, and I really do suggest you click on it and spend some time reading it. It's very transparent, very well written, and it explains quite clearly how they top up their various forms of road user charges through the licensing, and more specifically, it very transparently can justify why they have to increase the fuel tariffs. Now, probably at this stage, I now have to just explain quite quickly and as much as I can the difference between a fuel tax and a fuel tariff. Tax, by definition, means money that must go to a central tax pot, a central hub of money, and it's up to the politicians to decide how that money must be spent. And that seems to be very much the norm for many parts of the world. I don't know if it's the majority of parts, but many parts of the world, the amount that you pay extra on your fuel for government is not a tariff, but rather a tax, and therefore goes directly to a tax pot. When it is a tariff or a fee, it means that it is intended for one use and one use alone, not to go to that pot, but rather to go to a fund. Generally that is known as the road fund, the road fuel fund. Depending on where you are, they'll give it various terms. And that fund is intended to look after roads. So in North America, we tend to follow the principle of a fuel tax and not use road user charges. Under this principle in North America, that would be the equivalent of me paying, say, a tax on my electricity bill, and that money going to a central pot, and the government deciding how much of that money they're going to give to the electrical companies. Did you understand the issue? It's not quite my money going directly to the electrical company, but rather going to the government first, and then the government deciding how much it should give to the electrical companies. So that is our principle in North America. Whether or not it's right or wrong, that's up for debate on its own. I now want to discuss something else, which is the calculation of the wear and tear and how that is done, and to better understand where wear and tear truly happens, etc. There is a common belief and concept that when an engineer designs a form of infrastructure, a road or a bridge, they give it a lifespan. They will actually design for, say, a 30-year lifespan, with the intention that that road or bridge will be fully demolished and rebuilt in a period of 30 years. Now, in some cases, that is very, very justified. In other cases, when they give it that 30-year lifespan, that is just a sort of an engineering safety mechanism, so to speak, so that the engineer can say, I built it for 30 years. The fact that it's gone well beyond 30 years means it's gone beyond its design life, and I'm not going to take responsibility. It's that kind of belief. Now, The interesting part is that the overwhelming majority of infrastructure, built infrastructure in the world, spans far beyond 30 years and is intended to span far beyond 30 years. Let me give you an example. The Brooklyn Bridge, that's perhaps about 100 years old now, if I'm not mistaken. The Golden Gate Bridge, it's about 90 odd years of age right now. These bridges have no intention, there is no plan whatsoever to demolish these bridges and rebuild them. And one can carry on and on and on. There are literally hundreds of thousands of bridges in this world that are in that very category. There are, for example, in Europe, all the classic old bridges with beautiful sort of workmanship of design and sculpture, etc. Those bridges could be well in the hundreds and hundreds of years, and there's absolutely no intention to demolish the entire bridge and rebuild it from scratch, but rather to maintain, rehabilitate and operate that bridge. There are, of course, many examples of bridges that went beyond their design life and collapsed. And that is where things get a bit grey in this whole conversation. Should one truly be demolishing a bridge? Did they collapse because they had more of a design fault? That seems to be more the reason than anything else. When we look at, for example, roads, the concept of demolishing a road is not just removing the top surface layer, but rather having to dig down X amount of layers. A lot of people don't know this, but when you prepare a road, you tend to actually excavate to a certain depth and then relay the soil and compact it in layers as you build it up to the top to sort of create a big cushioning effect between the top tar or concrete layer all the way through into the soil downwards. And there's a lot involved in the development, design and build and construction of roads, including things such as drainage to make sure no water gets underneath, etc. So if one had to talk about scrapping or rebuilding an entire road, one would tend to imply that you're actually not only just going to remove the top surface layer, but you're going to go all the way down to those bottom layers, dig them out, including all the drainage culverts, etc., remove all of that and rebuild it. And to be honest with you, in our modern world, the only time that ever happens is if there's been, say, a flood or an earthquake. Then you tend to find that the authorities will have the road fully scrapped, fully demolished, and rebuilt altogether. So the point here is that many organizations that say that roads cannot pay for themselves are turning 100% to the engineering drawings and saying that, okay, how much does it cost to rebuild this entire road? Let's imagine to rebuild it would be, say, a full $1 odd billion or so to rebuild that road. And they put that into their accounting. But the reality of the matter is very far from that truth. The reality is that these roads are just maintained, they're resurfaced. They might have some spot checks where they do actually dig down to the bottom, fix certain parts that are, say, very soft, or there's been an issue, some sort of flooding, flooding in a specific part of the road, for example. But in essence, whole roads being scrapped doesn't happen. So we now are finding ourselves in a situation where various engineers are standing strong and standing firm and saying that, our roads cannot pay for each other, that we've got a huge backlog of construction that needs to be done because all of this needs to be totally rebuilt. That's not entirely true. So when we look at the road user charges study, we start trying to evaluate, for starters, how much money that road can make and how much it costs to maintain the road. Now, to be simple, clean and clear about this, it's relatively immaterial as far as the arguments go. If one had to decide that road does need to be totally rebuilt, that bridge just totally needs to be rebuilt, period, then the fuel levy, the fuel fee, needs to simply be recalculated to allow for that. If one had to say, for example, that in building roads we don't take into consideration the CO2 emissions of the vehicles, and that you want to price in the CO2 emissions, we can actually find a price for CO2 emissions. It does actually exist, and what one could do is quite simply just put it straight into the road user charge. So if that is a cost, if CO2 emissions is a cost that is intended to be borne out on the road user charge, one can quite simply add it straight to the fuel, and it's a straight function. It's a very simple, clear function that for every vehicle driving from point A to point B, they will not only contribute to the ongoing maintenance, but that fuel fee, that fuel levy, will also contribute to the CO2 that that vehicle emits. Yeah, I can imagine that electric vehicles, as they are growing, would have an impact on all of this, because electric vehicles don't use petrol or gasoline. But currently, electric vehicles make about 4% of the entire vehicle fleet on any given road. So it's relatively immaterial as opposed to all the other issues. Perhaps in the near future, it may be a new form of calculation to include electric vehicles into the road user charger study. But nonetheless, I'm hoping you now sort of appreciate and understand that one, streets, roads, etc. can pay for themselves, and that two, one shouldn't simply presume that all roads are subsidized. It depends on the jurisdiction. It could very well be that in a given jurisdiction, for example, the fuel charge, the fuel levy, is actually too low, and that the cost of maintaining, upgrading of the existing roads does need to come from other sources. That would be very unfortunate, because that just totally undermines the whole concept of road user charges, but nonetheless, it can happen. Lastly, just because road user charges works out, the price of a given road, one given road may run at a surplus, another given road may run at a deficit. So one would start to look at the entire network of roads, and one could actually find that certain roads operated enough of a surplus that that surplus can be thrown over to roads that run at a deficit, so that the entire network should be running at a mild surplus, should be. And that is actually the long and short of it. That's the end of the story. Road user charges need to be set at a level where the entire road network under the specific jurisdiction runs at a positive. That is good infrastructure management. That would be a good way of ensuring that the usage by vehicles covers all the costs borne out to ensure a nice, healthy environment that doesn't involve politics, so that politicians can't use roads as a sort of political argument for argument's sake, but rather that roads are a form of infrastructure that take care of themselves. So to countries like New Zealand and other countries that implement road user charges, I have a deep respect for you guys. Thank you very much for watching.